I want to tell you the real story of how a society collapses from the top before it collapses at the bottom. It does not begin with mobs in the street. It does not begin with a demagogue on television. It does not begin with one election, one scandal, or one policy disaster. It begins when the people running the system quietly redesign the system around themselves and then call the result virtue. That is what happened. For decades, the modern educated elite sold the public a fantasy. It said we lived in a meritocracy. It said anyone with enough talent and effort could rise. It said the institutions at the top were simply identifying excellence and rewarding it. But look more carefully, and you see that the elite was not merely identifying talent. It was manufacturing a hierarchy that favored the exact skills, manners, credentials, and cultural codes it already possessed. Then it looked at the predictable outcome and declared itself morally superior. That was the first betrayal. The upper class did not just have more money. It had better schools, better neighborhoods, better family stability, better coaching, better networks, better knowledge of how to navigate admissions, interviews, offices, and elite rituals. Its children learned how power works before they were old enough to name what they were learning. By the time formal competition began, the informal contest had already been won. Then came the insult. The children who benefited from that entire inheritance were praised as if they had built themselves from scratch. The children who did not benefit from it were left to wonder whether their exclusion meant they were simply not good enough. That is the psychological poison that modern elites never understood. Human beings can endure hardship. They can even endure unfairness for a while. What they do not endure well is sanctified unfairness, unfairness wrapped in moral language, unfairness that smiles at you and insists it is impartial. That kind of order produces not just economic resentment, but civilizational distrust. It fractures self-respect. It teaches one part of the country to feel chosen and another part to feel discarded. It creates a hidden caste system in a society that still wants to flatter itself with egalitarian slogans. And once that social injury deepens, the other injuries follow. Because the elite did not stop at rigging opportunity, it also dismantled the moral framework that might have helped the country survive the humiliation. It took questions that once belonged to the shared moral inheritance of a civilization and privatized them. What is truth? Your truth. What is the good life? Whatever you choose. What is duty? Something you negotiate. What is the self for? Expression. That language sounded humane, but it hollowed everything out. A free society cannot survive forever on procedural fairness alone. And it certainly cannot survive on pure self-invention. It needs some moral architecture that stands above impulse. It needs a people who believe their obligations stronger than preference, goods higher than appetite, and truths that do not bend each time the culture changes its mood. Take that away and you do not get enlightened freedom. You get spiritual drift. That is why so many advanced societies now feel curiously exhausted. They are wealthy, connected, entertained, and technologically powerful, yet also lonely, anxious, atomized, and desperate for belonging. They have multiplied options while shrinking purpose. They have expanded self-expression while weakening self-comment. They have become materially dense and morally light. That is not a stable combination. A culture without moral order becomes emotionally hungry. And emotionally hungry societies are easy prey for people who promise intensity. That is where the next stage began. The old elite, having rigged the game and hollowed out the center, unintentionally produced the conditions for a new elite to rise out of the backlash. This second elite dressed itself in anti-establishment rage. It spoke the language of disruption, revolt, and popular anger. In some cases, it correctly sensed that millions of citizens had been looked down on, ignored, and morally patronized for years. That part was true. But the people who climbed to the top of that revolt were often not genuine outsiders. They were ambitious, highly educated, institutionally fluent figures who understood that in a country full of humiliation, contempt could be marketed as courage. And so the public was handed a terrible bargain. On one side stood the managerial elite that had rigged the ladder and then blamed the people at the bottom for not climbing it. On the other side stood the institutional elite that fed on the anger created by that latter, but offered spectacle instead of repair. One side was smug, the other was reckless. Neither side knew how to heal the country. That is why the present moment feels so unstable. The public is not simply living through a normal partisan fight. It is living through a threefold collapse. First, the social fabric was damaged by a system that rewarded the already equipped and called that fairness. Second, the moral fabric was damaged by a culture that turned truth and value into private property. Third, the institutional fabric was damaged by a backlash that no longer distinguished reform from demolition. Once those three failures stack on top of one another, the society starts to feel brittle in every direction at once. Families weaken, trust falls, loneliness spreads, public life becomes theatrical, institutions lose legitimacy, citizens become more cynical, more isolated, and more open to radical simplifications. The whole country starts vibrating with concealed anger, and then everyone acts shocked when politics turns vicious. But politics is not the root of this problem. Politics is the symptom with the loudest microphone. The root problem is spiritual and civic. A civilization is not held together by GDP alone. It is not held together by credentials. It is not held together by efficient management. It is held together by moral habits, civic trust, and the quiet discipline of people who know they owe one another something. That kind of order takes generations to build and surprisingly little time to corrode. Once the elite class stopped honoring that truth, decline became only a matter of time. Still, I do not think the story ends there. History is not kind, but it is full of societies that reached moments of rupture and discovered that rupture can either destroy or awaken. Individuals go through that process all the time. They suffer their illusions cracked. The old story they told themselves stops working, then they have a choice. They can become broken and bitter, or they can become broken open. Nations face the same choice. That is what makes this moment dangerous. But also clarifying comfort allowed us to hide too much. Growth allowed us to excuse too much. Institutional prestige allowed us to trust people who no longer deserve trust. Crisis strips all that away. It forces a harsher honesty. What kind of people are we becoming? What kind of order did we build? Why are we so prosperous and yet so sad? Why are we so connected and yet so alone? Why does every political movement now feel like a tribe competing for emotional survival? These are not small questions. They are civilizational questions, and they cannot be answered merely by swapping one party for another or one celebrity leader for another. Politics matters, but politics sits downstream from a deeper moral culture. Laws can punish, subsidize, regulate, and restrain. They cannot teach reverence. They cannot manufacture duty. They cannot force people to love truth, honor marriage, serve neighbors, or see strangers with dignity. That work happens elsewhere. It happens in families that teach discipline and devotion. It happens in schools that form character, not merely ambition. It happens in congregations and moral communities that still believe goodness is real. It happens in neighborhoods, associations, and civic institutions where people practice loyalty, service, patience, and mutual obligation. It happens when citizens recover the habit of asking not just what they can demand from society, but what kind of person they must become to make society livable. That is why the path back is not just reform, it is reformation. We have to form a different type of person than the current system has been producing. For too long, the culture has rewarded the self as project. Curate yourself, market yourself, optimize yourself, defend yourself, express yourself. That is a powerful formula for anxiety and vanity. A healthier civilization teaches a different grammar. Govern yourself, serve others, join institutions worth preserving, inherit what is noble, repair what is broken, and carry responsibilities you did not invent. That shift will feel demanding because it is demanding. There is no serious renewal without discipline. There is no durable freedom without character. There is no thriving common life without moral standards stronger than appetite. And there is one more thing we need now more than ever, a deeper humanism. Not the soft, fashionable kind that avoids judgment because it fears discomfort. I mean defiant humanism. The kind that insists every person you meet carries a full human weight that your ideology is never allowed to erase. That person could have been you under different conditions. You might have made his mistakes, suffered his losses, learned his bitterness, inherited his weakness, or occupied his place. That awareness does not excuse corruption or vice, but it kills the arrogance that every elite eventually starts breathing like oxygen. And arrogance is the central sin here. The old elite was arrogant enough to believe its privileges were proof of merit. The new elite is arrogant enough to believe its cruelty is proof of honesty. A wounded society cannot be rebuilt by either form of pride. It has to be rebuilt by humility, service, and institutional seriousness. If we are wise, this rupture will make us less easily seduced by polished hypocrisy and less easily seduced by destructive performance. If we are wise, it will teach us that a country can survive bad headlines and bad quarters, but it cannot survive indefinitely when its upper class rigs success, its culture privatizes truth, and its politics rewards people who hate the very institution civilization depends on. That is the real reason society feels like it is falling apart, because the people who were supposed to steward the order first tilted it, then hollowed it out, then left the wreckage to men who wanted power more than repair. The country is now standing inside the consequences, and the only way out is not another elite trick, not another flattering myth, not another performance of rage. The only way out is the rebuilding of social trust, moral order, and civic life together, with citizens who are willing to become more serious than the age that made them. That is harder than revenge. It is slower than revolution, but it is the only thing that actually lasts